A very good evening to all of you, and welcome to our third monthly lecture in NIUA's lecture series. I wish we had a more intimate space because today's subject is really going to, I think, raise a lot of very interesting questions which we need to address. Today's evening's lecture is especially a very welcome lecture because Dr. Ravi Sundaram is going to talk about a subject which has become absorbed into all the talk about smart cities, which seems to have captured the imagination of a lot of people, however, largely an uninformed imagination. So there's a tendency towards fetishization of technology in this. There's a tendency towards the celebration of certain modes of urban development and production, which I'm sure Dr. Sundaram will cast a lot of light on. But very importantly for us, I think he is going to raise questions regarding what I found in the brief that he shared with us regarding two tropes. One might call them tropes of modernity, but now we seem to be moving towards a kind of hyper-modernity. And these two tropes would be information and transparency. And I think he raises questions about our understandings and assumptions about how information and transparency really work and how they get absorbed into systems of power and systems of negotiations with power. So I won't give any more extensive an introduction. I think we're all eager to listen to Dr. Sundaram's lecture. We also have with us Dr. Hélène Zérah, who is a scholar who has also been part of our circle of scholars who help cast light on urban development from a perspective which also questions a lot of the categories of development. And so it's a happy meeting of two scholars, I think, who will be able to have a conversation. And that's really the format in which we organize the lecture series, so that there is a respondent. I'm really the MC, so I won't really say much more. So welcome, Dr. Sundaram, Dr. Zérah.
Thank you, Jagan, and I would like to thank the National Institute of Urban Affairs for having me. I'm delighted to be here. I see many friends here, and I hope this can be a convivial and intense discussion, hopefully even controversial. This lecture today is coming out of a paper I wrote, and it's also coming out of contemporary concerns I have. And the contemporary concern is as follows. There's a particular model of the city that has been designated as the social city, starting from the 19th century, moving into the 1950s in India, with the great eras of planning, and kind of peaking until 1980. And the question I want to ask is, what has happened to that model with the new intersection of something we call informational infrastructures, which is now part of everyday life? And this is the question I'm asking. What kind of city are we talking about? There's a special issue of an architecture journal which is dedicated to intangible infrastructures, looking at the city after these new networks, and where I've also written. And this is now a concern of many urbanists, people who design cities, people who research cities, and people who struggle and fight in cities, right? So this is part of the problematic. So I'll read out sections, we'll go through a few slides, I hope open up a few questions. In the past few years have seen a significant expansion of urban investment in India, of which the JNURM is the best known and widely debated initiative. So the JNURM, as we all know, saw the central funding of urban infrastructures in many Indian cities, along with neoliberal reforms and public-private partnerships. So infrastructure, or what seems to stand in for it, has served as a reference point for a series of debates in the last 10-15 years. Urban expansion, displacement of the poor, public-private, and middle-class visions of global modernity. But less well known, in fact, I think increasingly well known now, are technologies of managing urban populations. These include the Aadhaar card for slum dwellers, which are linked to governmental welfare schemes, enumeration of urban land by linking it to digitized property titling schemes, CCTV platforms to survey streets and neighborhoods and now buses, massive transportation databases that are linked to GPS-enabled networks, and large GIS mapping initiatives sponsored by the Department of Science and Technology. So along with Aadhaar, which is being deployed everywhere as we know, I think these technological interventions have the potential of exceeding many such comparable schemes worldwide. I would say worldwide in terms of relationship to GNP, right? And the number of people affected. In India, it's supposed to be everyone. So in both financial allocation as well as elite rhetoric, in fact consensus, these are comparable to planning, the kind of fever of planning in the 1950s. And unlike unpopular, deeply unpopular land acquisition schemes, these technological initiatives in the city have tapped into, let's call it an information populism. Judges like it, journalists like it, middle class likes it, everyone likes it. It's okay. And so there are all kinds of discourses that are fed into this. So there's this overlapping of information, transparency, technology. So technology / transparency is the ethical filter through which urban infrastructure is made visible, right? It is designated as the ethical filter. In the 1950s it was planning, right? So the informational turn poses a lot of questions. It poses a lot of questions for the urban. And what are these questions? These include the relationships between social power and the urban poor, modes of visibility and disruption in an increasingly mediatized city, and fractures within urban regimes where competing state actors roll out competing infrastructures. It's not just the Aadhaar card. Every department seems to want to have some biometric scheme, some identification scheme. So this is what I mean. Competing actors within the state that push out these technology schemes as software companies come and pitch before, bureaucrats, politicians. So it's all kinds of new fractures are emerging. It's very, very interesting. And some of these things happened in the 50s, but here I think they take on all kinds of new players. And one of the key issues I want to raise, and we'll come to this in the discussion, a large part of this infrastructural shift is being pushed by private players. Private players are now the main generator of a sphere we call information. And this is a seismic change from the long arc of the urban, from starting from the mid-19th century to the 1950s, peaking around 1975 to 1980. So the scale of this is something we really need to think about. What kind of city are we talking about, right? Now, these are the kind of elements that I'm going to go through, and this is how my talk is organized. First, I'm going to talk about the crisis of the social city, the city of the 1950s. Second, I'm going to talk about information media and the new augmented reality. And this is drawing from all these discussions on augmented urbanism that people have raised. There are different debates that are going on. Third, I'm going to look at the implications of the informational turn. Fourth, I'm going to quickly allude, although not go into, information as a monetized value in neoliberal urbanism. And finally, and this is actually through the talk, the fate of politics. Because there's a certain form of urban politics which is intrinsically tied to the social city, kind of mobilization, the sphere of the corporation, the politician, the local mohalla level leader. So all these things are tied in, and people are asking questions, right? So let me try and conceptually lay out what I mean by urban infrastructure. Very simply, they're material forms. And that allow for exchange in space and connect populations, regions, and spaces. This really comes from anthropology and urbanism. And they're also socio-technical systems. I think infrastructures are really socio-technical systems that are embedded, bringing people and institutions together. What do I mean by this? Roads, pipes, electricity, water, communication, right? McLuhan once said the most interesting thing about the rise of print is not the book itself, is the environment print creates. And that's what I think electricity or any form of the socio-technical infrastructure does. It brings all kinds of things together. Great architects like Corbusier were aware of this. Infrastructures are socio-technical infrastructures. They produce effects. They blend in. People fight over it, right? Second, they're affective environments. By affective environments, there's smell, there's sight, spectacle. If you remember the passages in the old urban reports in the colonial era, the obsession with smell in India, how, this olfactory sensibility is very, very strong in cities. Communication, noise, ambient noise is everywhere, all right? So this is what I mean by a sensory environment. Deeply sensory. Last night I remember till 4 a.m. there was noise somewhere in the neighborhood because some jagran was going on. This is now intrinsic to our lives. You can't escape noise anymore. So what you have now in this new environment is an inflammation and an extension of the sensory, right? Media, I think, extends this sensory. It extends this sensory. It's a kind of prosthetic environment. You're extended, you're constantly thinking about it, right? Newspapers report it. Water. When water is talked about, it's not like the 1950s. It's very different today because it goes on television, expertise comes in, statistics are rolled out. The whole environment has changed. Now, at the core of the debate is, I think, a conceptual debate. For a long time, the life of things, humans, animals, and the life of machines were seen as separate. They were seen as separate. And the core argument was humans had autopoiesis. They were able to, they had cognition, they were able to remake the world, but machines had not. That's clearly not the case anymore. As we sit in this room, there are all kinds of machines that seem to be working in the background. This is what I mean by a socio-technical environment, right? Now let's take a simple thing like all the phones that people have. Maybe not all the phones, 90% of the phones people have in this room. Right? This is just a grab from a location interface of an iPhone. Every smartphone has this. At every second, your phone is giving off a signal indicator, telling the information provider about the location. That information is shared. It may be free, but it's entering a complex urban value chain. That information is remarketed and rematerialized and remonetized all the time. So what I'm talking about is not just about surveillance by the state. It's a transformation of what we designate as value. Every second. Unless you're a hacker and you've turned all your settings off. Right? Even the cheapest phone does this. The new taxi companies monetize the new GIS and the GPS information. This is what is producing value in the city, and this is what we need to really think about. What do these urban informational grids do to the way space is organized? When Ola or Uber sets up its networks and offers to our beloved transport department, we can actually provide our information to modernize you. We have to ask what kind of value is this creating? So these are the kind of key questions that I'm interested in. So what is this city-based information? Spatial, water, information of water. The water company trying to monetize it is happening all over the world. Electricity, right? Creating, mapping, users onto GIS spaces. These are all issues we need to think. All private companies are doing this. Political opinion. Right? So these are all questions. So this extension of ourselves is really fundamental urban questions. But what kind of urban questions do we ask now? When a lot of these grids are outside the domain of what we would call the public. What kind of political and critical questions can we ask? About ownership, about access, the old question of the urban public domain. I think these are the kind of questions that are actually interesting. We are actually in the beginning of this, but we have a regime which is totally invested to this space. So this space is already here and it's coming, and we need to acknowledge the kind of research issues that open up. Right? Now, so what I'm kind of opening up really are the questions about the old form of political claim making, which a political leader would claim. So if you're asking questions about transport, what kind of issues would you throw up? What does the informational move do when you don't have all the information, right? And what does enumeration do to populations in the city? once your information is increasingly digitized, and the digitized information is now in the hands of multiple players who are creating value for all kinds of other players, right? And third, what happens to an urban infrastructure that can only be made visible through technological prisms? In a way, it always was, but increasingly that seems to be a constitutive prism, right? So we have to ask all kinds of key issues. So I think these databases now are being positioned as a way of telling things about the city, right? So, okay. Let me now I want to go to give you a little sense of the history that this is trying to unpack. This move is trying to, for a long time, we had a paper regime, and we still do. We still do. So, colonial power, right from the time of the East India Company, was based on the multiplication of writing genres as means of authentication. So, what you had really was constant authentication under colonialism, right from the beginning of the East India Company. Miles Ogborn has a fantastic book on this. So, you have this constant anxiety from the time of colonialism about the parcha, the document. India is the only place where everything has to be counter-verified and counter-signed and counter-attested. It really starts from so what Miles Ogborn argues is comes from the time of the East India Company. So there's so much anxiety about the possessor of the document that it has to go through complicated multiple verification procedures. So this thing is actually so what you have are systems of stamps, counter-signature, and circulation of paper genres. So what document systems increasingly tried to do from the 19th century was collectivize bureaucratic power and render it distinct from the public. This is something away from the public, right? But this power, as we know, can be diluted by constant recirculation. So colonial power was really based on the extensive deployment of these paper-based systems for routine policing, managing migrants, epidemics, and cross-border movements. So by the 1930s, and Tarangani Sriraman, who's in the audience, her dissertation does this beautifully. It shows this, that how this information system actually was expanded for ration cards, and later in the 1950s into a larger post-colonial system. Now, in post-colonial modes of governance, this shifts in a very interesting way. And this is what the informational shift is trying to unseat. Well, how does it shift? Essentially, paper-based systems, I think, played a dual role. They allowed the regime to manage urban residents through systems of inclusion and exclusion. We know that. Getting into the voter ID card, getting an electricity connection, you have to get into a formal list somehow or the other. This is part of the way urban systems are managed, right? And they allow political groups entry into the database. It becomes part of political claim making. So, but very interestingly, it was never uniform. So entry into one information system could coexist with tactical invisibility in another. You may not have an authorized, plot, but you could have an electricity connection. You could get a bill. This is what I mean. Coexistence of multiple, memberships, where X may not know what Y is. I think Aadhaar is hoping there will just be one, where the power of one, and I think this is a very complex paper morphology which the paper database introduces, which we've all been part of. We've all been part of this world. It's a very interesting, flexible world, and it allows the system all kinds of flexibility, not just to manage cities, to manage urban politics, right? So if you see how this works in cities, is very interesting. So this is actually courtesy a good friend of mine, Solomon Benjamin. So on the left, you have classic morphology of any street, which he's drawn very beautifully when he was living in Jangpura in the 1980s, right? Where people slowly overlap and overbuild, create an extension, create a shop front, a whole sort of mohalla develops very, very organically and slowly. On the right is a typical enumeration document in the paper regime from Karnataka. So all kinds of complex overwriting is taking place. So, for example, you were on Ambedkar's birthday, all Dalit women will get free access to something else. On someone else, on this occasion, all children of a particular, poorer community would get something. So all this would be overwritten and written over and over again into urban enumeration documents. So it is not a standardized document. It's a very complex set of writing that took place. And this actually gave all kinds of flexibilities. It is part of a very complex web of claim making in the city, linked to water, electricity, people without legal rights. You may not actually have an election ID card, but you got the right to live in the city by getting access to certain benefits. So extremely leaky system. You could slide between one and the two, and this is the kind of very interesting world that existed in India, I would say, for almost 60, 70 years. And it still exists. It still exists in many parts of India, and I think it will continue to exist. But this is the world that is being addressed in this new shift. Right? So, essentially, this is the way I'm going to go right now, very quickly. I'm going to very quickly look at the social city. I'm going to zip through informality and the urban crisis after 1977. Right? This is post-emergency period. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about middle-class liberalism, which is really before the big ceiling in Delhi, and the push of transparency in a very big way by courts, by middle-class advocates, and the increasing push of technological solutions that were being pitched to courts as a solution to changing the city, and the rise of informational discourse. So it's actually three phases. You have the social city, with a shift to this, this what I call civic liberalism, where middle class is now pushing certain informational and transparent solutions. And the third period, which we are now entered into, which is a kind of very murky period, where private players have become dominant. It's completely dominant in naming infrastructure and providing informational infrastructure. I'm talking about informational infrastructure. I would suspect in other infrastructure too, but informational infrastructure is absolutely hegemonic, right? And so this is increasingly going to raise all kinds of key questions about life itself. And Aadhaar is a great model for this shift, because as you know, many of the data that Aadhaar sourced was done through private players. And people were paid. It's a completely monetized model, right? This is a kind of indicative of the shift, but now it's a complete shift, right? Okay. So first, you remember partition and sovereignty, right? And this is the kind of mythic moment, just after 15th August. It's a beautiful moment. For me, it's always a beautiful image where people have, taken over, the space. I think it's probably the only time they took over the space like this. And then you have catastrophe, which is a kind of, this is what I mean, it's mythic. It's something that is there in our memory, it's constitutive of our memory. Like Nehru's, Nehru's speech, this is, especially in the way this city was, this was a largely Islamic city. That city died, basically, at 947. And a section of the city where people were forced to migrate to Pakistan. And so the city really changed. And there is the immediate image of an urban crisis that comes. And very soon after the crisis is this whole discourse around planning. This is I'm not going detailed into this. I have a book where I have a long chapter on planning. I'm not going to go into this. But I'm just setting up the way the social city is framed. Right? And what you have, one very interesting thing in the 1950s, which I looked at, was the Urban Report. It's a very famous report that came out just before the master plan debates took off. And this is the Birla Committee report to review the Delhi Improvement Trust. Those of you who haven't read it should have a look at it. It's a very interesting report. And one of the things that the Birla Committee report did was set up this diagnostic of the slum, in which a particular social environment is, you look at the description, where it says, the meanness and the squalor which stretches its tentacles upwards from the lives of our less fortunate citizens. The slums hold us back While they exist, the roots of our civilization are rotten and our corporate existence as a people are diseased. So this whole is a kind of social pathology. It's really a dramaturgy of social pathology, which is kind of holding back the city, right? We have to solve this. We have to solve this. How do you solve it? So, and one of the things the Birla Committee said is we need planning. Planning is the only way. And that lays ground for the master plan discussions to take off. Right? It's a crucial report before the master plan debates take off, right? But what is interesting for me is not just the presence of that committee, but the way it sets up a kind of social city, right? It's a great danger, right? Now, of course, then you have the Delhi master plan, in which you have a very major jaundice epidemic. Rajkumari Amrit Kaur writes to the Ford Foundation, and Ford Foundation sends a whole stream of planners, and this is something I've looked at in detail. They came from the regionalist movement, and they brought all kinds of different sociologists and different modernization theories, deeply anxious of traditional Indian urban practices, and they designated those practices, one of the list in the master plan, as something unurban, and it set up a sort of permanent discourse in the city. So this is a kind of model of the social city. The city can be planned, social pathologies can be mapped, can be designated, and we can, in a technocratic way, through planning models and zoning, we can deal with it, right? And this is, of course, what they came up with: a color-coded zoning map, a rational zoning map, which they thought was egalitarian because it laid out in a transparent fashion who had access to what and what was designated for what, right? Of course, there was a logic of displacement also set in, because many communities which they designated as unurban or noxious had to leave the city constitutively in the master plan. It's all there in the debates, right? So you have this vast army of consultants descending on city. Albert Mayer, who led the team, was mostly in New York. 50% he was in New York. Very much like our smart city consultants, shuttling between various cities, big frequent flyer. You know, the model is still the same. But whatever you say, Albert Mayer and his team were committed to some form of egalitarian city. You know, you can't say, and they had a notion of a public city, that the city will be managed by a public corporation. Planners and people who produce information are owned to public authorities who are elected. This is the kind of overall model, right? So I'm not going in detail into this, right? Now, let's now quickly shift to the present. What you have really after the emergency, in the emergency this model really peaks, the post-independence model, and after the emergency there's a great expansion of the city with great freedoms, vast expansion, the opening up of the whole informal debate, which comes up not just in India but all over the world. Asia, Africa, Latin America, there's a huge debate going on the new form of urbanism, which is designated as informal. And really, after the emergency, this really takes off. Now, what you have also with this expansion is a media boom. Those of you who remember, who were here in the 1980s, I was a student in the 1980s, I remember the whole city changed in the 1980s. So what did you have by this, what do I mean by this media zone? So designated by the space that is called informal, the media zone, I think, produced an urban geography, a vibrant, what I call a media urbanism. So what you had from the 1980s onwards, a transformation of post-colonial life into a dynamic technological culture. The VCR, the amplified amplification of sound, which really takes off from the 1980s. Televisions coming in, use of video cassettes in political campaigns, advertising campaigns, posters everywhere. You know, it really changes geography. It changes the way you sense and see the city. Large advertising, once the hand-painted advertisements went and the digital ones came, it really changes the geography of the city. So urban populations, so via the cellular phone, increasingly, media and technological networks are now part of urban infrastructures. The idea of infrastructure is now constitutively technological. Urban populations have often mobilized low-cost mobile technologies to bypass official channels and create local information and citywide possibilities. And this we know from all kinds of mobile phone research. Sabziwala is getting latest, price information. There are all kinds of interesting research going on. Right? So what these massive expansions, I think, of new media infrastructures have thrown the older control model of the regime, the post-independence control model of the regime, into disarray. So what you have is really a population of potential media producers, not just an uneducated mass to be nurtured by the government and traditional media. And the population really changed at that time. So I think this changed media ecology, really changed media ecology, has also given voice to new mobilizations by resurgent middle class activists who really take off in the city from the mid 1990s onwards. Now, who are these activists? These include resident welfare associations, neoliberal activists, people who want the market everywhere, ecological groups, transparency campaigners. Those of you who remember the 90s, you see how, for the first time, urban discourse saw an opening up with new claimants on urban discourse. Urban discourse was something planners did, it's something government did. Really, you don't want to be dealing with that world. But now ordinary citizens are starting to make claims on urban discourse, right? So this actually totally changes by the 1990s. So there are 2-3 sites for this: the television studio, the court case. The court case is a fundamental site for middle class urbanism. So what the court case does is, in the court case, information and transparency are made the key vector of reforming the city. The idea is there's a corrupt body politic, there are corrupt politicians who have destroyed and cannibalized the city. What you need is a clean technological solution to solve older forms of mediation. So what you have is information on traffic accidents, pollution is increasingly relayed through the city. You have electronic screens, television, cellular phones, roadside billboards. So what you have in transparency is the coming of transparency, the unmediated access to information, the unmediated infrastructural solutions to solving urban problems, pushing CCTV everywhere, uploading all urban information online. Some of it is very, very interesting and good. So this actually peaks, this transparency movement really peaks at the Anna Hazare moment in Delhi, and now it's now part of public discourse. It's now completely part of public discourse. Now, if you go back to transparency, its great revival is in the 1990s. In the decade of neoliberal ideologies, financial speculation, and a delegitimation of a large corpus of the human sciences. So this was a discovery of new sources of opacity along with legal rationalism. This is the big debate in the 1990s. So new concern to make visible invisible moved into a discourse of intervention. Very famous Peruvian economist Hernando de Soto argued for formal property rights to mobilize what he called the undead capital of the South. And Hernando de Soto was a regular visitor in the last 2 regimes, visiting the Urban Development Ministry. So what you also have is NGOs that call for legally visible and enumerated rights for migrants, microfinance, and new forms of documentation. These could include new voter ID cards, new forms of digitized enumeration for the slum poor, right? And you also have a vast army of consultants and new form of expertise devoted to extract some form of visibility that could be measured for efficiency. So you have audit culture. All universities now are obsessed with audit culture. So a whole new army of audits start taking place. The audit is now the new ethical filter. This is what I mean by infrastructure becomes the ethical filter. The CAG, if you remember, in the last 10 years, how many of us thought about the CAG in the 1990s? I didn't. Not really. Now CAG is a major player. CAG reports you start coming on television. So the audit becomes a way to measure efficiency of it. This is all part of the informationalization of life, right? And this takes off from the 1990s, which is part of the neoliberal turn. So what you have are new review reports, new standards set by consultants. Consultants set the standards for running life. McKinsey is a very major player in India. So this is a part of the whole debate that really comes in. It's a very interesting. So UK universities I know were the first victims to this audit culture, and really transforms the way universities are run. I know this for a fact. The minute the number of articles you publish gets monetized into certain levels, imagine what it does to urban infrastructure. I think large train wrecks. So what you have, Marilyn Strathern, the anthropologist, has a beautiful essay where she calls the tyranny of transparency. A very well-known British anthropologist. She calls the tyranny of transparency. She says a suppression of experimental and long-term possibilities in order to denote quantifiable standards. All of you know the amount of the JNURM budget that is devoted to consultants. I needn't go into. This is constitutive of the new urban turn. And transparency means the quantification and the measurability. It's all about producing value and measuring value. Exactly what your phone is doing. It's producing value for someone else. So once this principle is an organizing infrastructural principle, I think the urban life, we have to understand what urban life means. So urban transparency campaigns are really taking off at this time. In Bangalore, the NGO Janagraha began a highly publicized effort to streamline the urban municipality. We know about Janagraha. At a statewide level, this is well before Aadhaar, Bhumi was launched in Karnataka to digitize land records. So today, NGOs work with local government to help with data collection for biometric survey for slum dwellers in Bombay, Delhi. GIS projects have spread to many Indian cities. So what you have is, I think for me, in a post-colonial context of India, the shift to information infrastructures can be said to represent a rediscovery of the old urban population for the regime. So existing technologies like urban enumeration, like ration cards and electoral lists, were seen in the new discourse as complicit with the corrupt legacy of politics. Something politicians could manipulate. You remember that image I showed of that overwritten piece of paper? It's seen as part of a corrupt machine. You can manipulate that machine. We need to clean it up, plug leaks. It's all about plugging leaks. So, and then there's a huge obsession, we just come to this, about fragmentation of urban authority and interdepartmental conflicts. So, Sheila Dikshit's favorite slogan used to be, there's multiple jurisdictions in the city, so you can't do anything. This is a huge part of the discourse. Remember, it's all woven into the discourse. You need technological solutions to solve this. So this was really for the technocrats, regime managers, information infrastructures offered an attractive alternative for reassembling the social. So what you have is really a massive effort to reassemble the urban social and set up new grids of management, not compromised by the corporeal turns of everyday life, right? You wouldn't have to rush to your politician who will then make a few phone calls. It'll all be done through a database. It'll be digitally visible. It'll be very clear. One bit of information will speak to something else. So what you have is really a new wager on informationalization that is taking off by 2005. So it's a delicate balance, I think, between regime modernization, transparency, and it's a very delicate balance, because once you set new infrastructures into place, all kinds of departments of the regime itself will start pulling and start making claims. All of us know the debates around Aadhaar. Sections of the government didn't want Aadhaar. So it opens up new, very interesting conflicts in regime authority. This actually happened even during the master plan. When the Americans landed, the local planners were horrified because they'd been totally bypassed. But I think now it's extremely complicated, extremely complicated. So one of the things I sort of looked at was the way one of the things I looked at was a GIS planning module that took place in Delhi. And if you see the difference in planning, information really is set up to produce the city as a visible, rational entity. And this is really done for the public, but really it spoke to the government. It produces the city as a rational, and of course they used huge elements of information too. They used aerial surveys, they used physical surveys, the cadastral map. The planning map is also an informational map, but it spoke to different public entities. We all know this. It's mediated through different public entities, right? And it's a public document that is made by planners who are answerable to a political authority, right? Now, then you had transparency and middle class mobilization. And then you have the new information regime. This is where we are now. So you have mapping the social body. By the social body, I mean populations, the health of populations through informational technology. We have Aadhaar, mobile linked social policy. Everything is linked to that phone I showed you, which is not just visible. Hopefully, the idea is it's not just visible to companies like Google Maps, who will use the value to sell it to shopkeepers who can place their, and marketeers who will take your personal information and then use it to market things, right? And it'll also be accessible to government because government wants to be part of the story. So it's data-driven policy. You know this formula of mobile Aadhaar and the bank account. This kind of formula that they're coming up with. It has a very interesting urban form that it's taking. So you have the old city corrupted by leakages, venal local politicians, and this new system will hopefully clean it up. That's the kind of argument that is coming out. Now, before I go into this, let me set this up basically. So what you have now is part of this big debate on cities, and I'm drawing from some of the debates I've also been involved in. This is the whole notion of the augmented urbanism. And Stephen Graham, in his very important book, he calls this new software sorted geography. He's a very well-known British geographer in Durham. Software sorted geographies. So all kinds of social data is now generated through map-making devices, which are produced through algorithms. We know this. Without algorithms, no map is going to work now. Not just the map on your phone, but social maps that planners use. Right? They're produced by algorithms that are written by various programmers. Right? So what you have is a mixture of software. Software is constitutive. Surveillance. By surveillance, I don't mean people like the CIA or the RAW. No, including the kind of people who are mapping your and my personal data. This is a kind of normative surveillance regime. And media objects, things like phones, CCTV objects, water data, sensors that produce water data, sensors on electricity lines. These are all new media objects. And all this is set into motion by all kinds of elements. And in middle class urbanism, I remember one court case I was in a traffic, I was following a traffic case and I was doing field work, and the judge would insist that the CCTV be put up everywhere in the city, including people's neighborhoods. And actually, the MCD lawyer, thank God, at that time, I don't know who the lawyer was, actually took a decent position. He said, we don't have a political consensus for these things. We have to go to the people. And so this basically is this new form of claim making, I think, creates public discourse, a kind of discourse among policymakers to make this visible. So now you have vast bodies of user-determined information coming from mobile phones that we know, vast amount of it, which is being sold all over the country. There's a researcher of mine who was with these two very interesting startups in Delhi, and these two startups are mapping social data in Delhi, in cities. They're mapping social data, which include health, education, electricity, but they're also mapping consumer data. What would be called consumer data? What are people buying? What are people, and they're trying to map these two things together. But remember, value is being created and monetized and being pitched to someone. This is part of the new social, right? So new, what is called intangible infrastructures. It's an intangible infrastructure because it's not tangible like in the old days. It's not just a flyover and a water pipe. But these are infrastructures which are informational infrastructures, which are creating value and remapping the city. They're trying to remap the city, right? And an increasing privatized space, because the claims there are through value, completely through value. If you and I need this data for research, we'll have to buy it. And so it's a kind of new transaction that is taking place. So it's a kind of urban multiple. Place, what we call place. We call something called place. I think it's now an augmented, overlapping reality with all these other elements that are coming onto it. And this raises all kinds of questions, which we haven't even started to think about. And I never thought this will happen so fast in India. I never ever imagined. But now, after seeing all the material that's coming out from research, what the kind of information mobile companies have been generating for the past 5 years, our mobile companies, if you have a mobile phone, it's being generated on what you do, what you buy, where you go, and remonetization of this value, I realize cities are being remapped as we speak and revalued as we speak. And someone else is doing it, who we will never see in our lives, right? At least Albert Mayer and company you saw. They published books that were published, by the government press. This is a completely new world. So let me start with the state, the kind of claims on this. How much time do I have, Jagan? Yeah, so I 10 minutes, 10 minutes. So let's start with the state. These are kind of claim making on this world. So this is something I looked at. I did some fieldwork here, and this is the GIS survey, the DSSDI which is now a reality in Delhi. And I did some fieldwork here when they were doing the survey. This is right at the early phase when the Survey of India, like all our beloved government institutions, had subcontracted it to this thing called Navyuga Infrastructure. Which is a large company which is also making CCTV solutions for cities. So it's urban infrastructure cum surveillance, right? So Navyuga, so it's a very interesting thing when Navyuga actually mapped the city. They had many field workers. They had these instrumentation machines that would put 3D images of the city. And one big concern, and this is also coming from a court case, where there's competing jurisdiction among government departments. So the main thing was produce a database that will solve this. So they were agglomerating. This is what algorithms do. They were agglomerating 35 government databases. This is what social mapping does. So they were trying to agglomerate this, and those guys who were writing the algorithm were going nuts, because most of the city was not even formal. Think about it. Most of Delhi at the time they were doing, even now, is not. Most cities in India work through tenure, not title. All of us who know cities know this. People don't have title. They mobilize and make claim. They live in something called unauthorized settlements. They have tenure but not title. They live in a place but they not have title to it. So here in the state, this is a state, picture of the state, where all these government databases are trying to be mapped onto an algorithm and mapped onto a thing, which the idea was, the court's idea and the technocratic idea was, this will solve it. Of course it didn't solve it. But this is the model, right? So this is part of the new augmented reality, right? And here is another very interesting, though you know this, some of you know this. This is the DIMTS, mapping of buses, also initiated by a court case. If you remember the Blue Line court cases, which set in speed governors. And remember, all these are coming from court cases. The court insists that autos should have GPSs. They insist that buses should have it. But all these are now being mapped. This is a screenshot from a live tracking. This is a database. This is informational data. Because the informational databases are everywhere. Ola will have this. Uber will have this. Everyone has this. This is what I mean by the informational infrastructural grid. Intangible. Of course, there are real things, real buses there, but the infrastructural information on how these things behave and how these things connect and speak to each other is organized by someone else, right? So this is of course a government thing, and this was part of the GIS thing where they were basically mapping various forms. If you realize, so that there's an aerial map. This is something the master plan also used, and they were mapping various elements onto the GIS grid. And of course, the key is to write an algorithm which will make it searchable. Mapping this is possible, but you have to write an algorithm that makes it searchable. And of course, there was a property survey. And it's very interesting. In 4 areas, these surveyors got attacked, because you go and ask, do you own the house? Do you have title to the house? And of course, it's not very popular in every neighborhood, right? I mean, Sangam Vihar, I don't know what. So this is the kind of peculiar form of claim making that happens, and it's a way of making the city visible. This is what I mean by technologies that make the city visible. It's a kind of infrastructural move, right? And of course, the idea was what you have on the right hand are inputs that would be inputted with these different databases. Who owns the land? Who has title? Do you have an electricity bill? And it could be searchable to different government institutions. All this looks gobbledygook right now, but the thing is, there are major players that are involved in this, and there are people in the state who think this is, the greatest thing since sliced bread. It's really, a wonderful thing. And so the software has now been released. But I've actually went there during the fieldwork. Is a very interesting time when this is being made, because people are far more open and speak to you about the problems they are having. Now they also used Masavi maps. They had four people, and they went to Patwaris and got Masavi maps, which are old maps, to actually translate it and feed it into the informational grid. It's a very ambitious project. So basically, this takes off after the attack on the Bombay, hotel. And then suddenly, the government apparently when they took over the Taj, when they attacked the Taj, the NSG did not have the original map. I think there's some story about it. They didn't have the plan, the original plan. They had an unauthorized plan. So after that, I think Kapil Sibal gave a huge amount of money to this. Huge amount of money. So these guys were extremely well endowed. So, there's vast amounts of money that is now coming into these infrastructural domains, right? So this is some other thing they had. This is another Kapil Sibal idea, also a court idea, that you have all these monitoring cameras that will look for unauthorized construction. Of course, clearly, apart from the NDMC area, I wonder what they saw and what has happened to this. So these are kind of operating at the level of the mythic, but someone is making money on it. Monetization of infrastructural claims, right? So now let's then move to the world of the private. Okay. Just come. Give me a second. Yeah. So this I think is the new world. This kind of private infrastructure, which is the world most of us are also part of. So you have mobile phone companies. We know this. All your mobile phone companies generate vast amounts of data on your movement. If you have a postpaid connection, best of luck, because all your data is the property of the mobile phone company, right? And what kind of things you buy, what kind of things you use, what are the kind of value you're producing, right? Which are the areas you frequent. Transportation, Uber, Ola, and many new startups. Transportation databases are huge now, very big. And e-marketing. Now, I don't know if any of you have noticed, but Flipkart has its own infrastructure company called eCart. Although it's formally illegal, you're not supposed to have multiple, but they have this thing called WS Retail, which distributes the thing. It's a very interesting infrastructural innovation. And then they have this thing called eCart, which bypasses the post office and the couriers to cut down value addition, right? It transforms the city. You have warehousing in the city, you have independent networks in the city, you have all kinds of informational chains produced in the city, right? Circulation of goods in the city. Imagine if you're a planner, you're trying to project all these things in the future. Because there's no information law, public information law yet, which says all this information, part of it should be in the public domain. So you have e-marketing, spatial infrastructure. So mapping all this onto GIS maps. Then social data. Of course, we know social data. Political parties use this in the election campaign. Aam Aadmi Party used this very successfully in Delhi. The BJP, of course, national election. We know what happened. They did very well. And Facebook, Google, and social media. Of course, the important thing about social media is even though it's free, it's a fiction, because free is just giving you, opening a door. Every moment you are creating value for some. Have you seen the ads that come on the right when you're on a Facebook page? They are ads that come out of cookies you generate while you're using Facebook, right? Every marketer knows this. Your cookies generate information about your personal habits. Whether you're shopping from a place, whether you're reading sexually salacious material, whatever it is, doesn't matter. So those cookies generate value to the e-marketeers, who then position ads. This is the basic ABC of creating value. In a city, this is in general, in a city, the interest would be on spatial movements and the mapping of consumption to spatial movements. And I think for these new social data companies, the mapping of water, electricity, and other needs, television consumption. Potentially, if this was open and if it is a public regime, I think we could utilize this in opening different questions, right? So let me just close it here and finalize with certain key questions that I want to ask. I think very simply, the informational turn has sought to update and modernize the old relationship between urban populations, land, and social power. It's a very basic level. So once you set out biometric identification as the main filter to enter urban citizenship, so the Aadhaar is now the main filter, despite the Supreme Court verdict. The Election Commission is planning to map its database onto Aadhaar. Aadhaar is the filter to urban citizenship, right? GIS mapping sets up to open up large tracts of urban land, including the informal zones. So as technological infrastructures managed by private companies and state technocrats, traditional political mobilization, I think, faces very serious questions into what kind of information it had access to. So what is interesting about older urban politics, and I think continues to be interesting, was that it had produced itself as a gateway to paper information regimes in the city. So your local pradhan would get you access to the ration card. Would get you access to the ration card. There was all kinds of complex paper networks that I think still operate, but they'd been set up. I think this new regime, in the long term, as an urban regime, is trying to unseat that. Now, whether it does it, I don't know. So I think the question for us is, I think, and I want to end here, what kind of city are we ended up with today? Someone who I was speaking to just before said we now live in barbaric cities. I think this may not be barbaric, but this is something else, I think, which opens up questions of politics, visibility, and what is public life. Thank you.
Thank you, Ravi. I've been taking a lot of notes. This is a lesson. Can I request Mary Hélène for your comments, please?
Is it working? I'm also sitting here. Well, this is really a complicated task to talk after you and this wonderful talk. First, of course, I have to thank the NIUA for inviting me to comment on the presentation made by Ravi and what he calls informational turn. And actually, I have to say a sweeping tour when I read the paper this morning, and thanks for sharing the paper with me. I thought you were talking about 40 or 50 years, and now you've extended for a much longer period of time. So it's a very interesting sweeping tour from the history of cities till today and maybe the future. And also I have to unthank the NIUA because I thought I would not be alone sitting on the panel. And actually I find myself all alone to try to respond to your paper or to maybe engage in a discussion. So I will try to be very short because we don't have much time and it is too rich to engage fully with what you've tried to tell us. But maybe I wanted to just raise a few points around some of the central terms that you've been using. And in fact, some of my questions you've answered during the talk, so it will be even shorter. I think one of the terms, what you've been trying to talk about is the question of enumeration, which is very central to the manner in which databases were produced and were historically constructed. So in the first part of your presentation, I think you try to show how paper-based databases were technologies of authentication, verification, visibilities, and of course technologies of control. And by control, of course, of exclusion, which was used by colonial and later post-colonial powers. And also the idea that they were fluid, that they were ambiguous, and therefore they kind of allowed people to navigate and harness these holes to be able to access the cities and to build their lives in these cities. I think what you're trying to say is you're making 2 points. First is that it has changed tremendously with this advent of what you call judiciary, media, and form of elite-dominated civic urbanism. And second, how this regime, which we could call, I'm just thinking of the French term bien pensant, I think bien pensant regime is kind of, has actually totally put forward this importance of media, ICT, and what you're showing is that under the promise of transparency and legibility, in fact, we are creating a system which has other ways of exclusion, and you're not denying that there were exclusion processes before, but these processes of exclusion are much more difficult to circumvent and much more difficult to bypass. And I think the example of the cadastral reforms and the legibility of property title is a very clear example, and I cannot agree more with you, so I'm a bit in a fix here because I don't know. The only thing maybe I would like to raise, if my role is maybe to play the devil's advocate, is to ask you and to maybe ask you if you see whether another future is possible or not. And if we are thinking of Arjun Appadurai's work on self-enumeration, which is mostly based on Mumbai, which also is an indirect comment on the fact that you place a lot of your example in Delhi. So do you see Delhi really as a metaphor, or do you see that happening everywhere, which I think it does, is the fact of, I think, the very interesting idea that you have about these millions of media producers. In fact, we are all producing information, media content, social data, etc., which you have already explored much before, is can these tools also lead to new forms of self-enumeration? What Arjun Appadurai said is that self-enumeration was really a very strong counter-power tool. So how do you see maybe the possibility, I'm just asking a question, of a foundation for a form of technology-based popular or subaltern urbanism? Is there any such potential? Is there, what can be the foundation for that? Especially, I think, since access to some of these technologies, of course, they are at different cost. I don't know the cost of an iPhone. I still have a very cheap and not very sophisticated phone, but I guess it means that this technology can be rather widespread. So what does it mean in terms of what could be the foundation of that form of maybe technological subaltern urbanism? The second, I think, question or terms you try to bring together are really the embedded question of data, transparency, legibility, and urban crisis, that you do bring together again perfectly. I think it's very well articulated. So again, there's not much to say, but this idea that there's a promise, yeah, it's a mythic, it's what you're saying, it's this promise future of transparency, legibility, and mostly solving this urban crisis that everybody feel we are in the middle. And I think what you show is also the importance of this strong private interest and this idea of wanting to include everybody into market practices. Nevertheless, again, if we try to play the devil's advocate, I would have I was thinking of two examples when I was reading the paper, which I thought maybe would force us to think further about this relationship between institutional change and technology, which we need to unpack a little bit more, I thought. So the first example, I was thinking about the GIS-based system that you were describing for the Delhi government, and I was remembering the PhD that was recently defended by Laure Criqui, where she looks at how the Delhi Water Board is trying to expand services in unauthorized colonies for water and sewerage services, and where there is no possibility for the Delhi Water Board to actually access the data that has been produced and which is the property of the Delhi government. And this really raises the question about the transformative role or not of these ICT technologies, because in that case, again, we could see some maybe potential of bringing together a number of information that could help expansion of services in the city. So do we tend to overestimate their transformative role or not of these technologies? And if not, then can we explore how the technology is actually bringing or not bringing institutional change? Because in that case, there were very clearly secrecy rules, war turfs between departments. That's what you were saying about the complexity of institutional organization. So I think it would be really interesting to ask you how you see the channels in which the changes is actually happening in the institutions, in the state institution, beyond just the idea of what it promises, but how concretely it does operate. The second thing I was thinking of when I was reading it this morning is to build a bit more on this idea of ownership. Well, you mentioned it today, but I was thinking, secrecy is often linked to ownership. In many ways, the idea that the data, who owner of that data, and of course, as you say, private companies seem to own a lot of data today. So, but it is also a world of very fast circulation of information, and often outside the mainstream media. Again, I'm talking from someone who is neither on Instagram, neither on Snapchat, on Twitter, and even Facebook, which is now apparently for all people like me. I've never been on it, so I have no clue how it functions very well, but I think this idea that there is also maybe a diffused or disseminated ownership of data, and that it can circulate very fast, and it could also be a form of counterpower. So I was just also thinking of the work of Jeremy Rifkin. I'm not sure this is very relevant here, but all the work around the collaborative commons that, according to him, will be maybe the beginning of the demise of a form of capitalism, because the cost of production of many of these media objects is actually almost nil. So do you think, again, it's coming back to the previous question, that it could contribute maybe to improve life of the city? So I was maybe, I have no clue since I don't know technologies, I was thinking that, let's take the example of pollution in Delhi. There are a lot of data on pollution. In fact, the Delhi government financed some consultant to do some work on pollution in Delhi, and during the Commonwealth Games, suddenly all these numbers were banned. There was really this idea of data is important, but still it needs to be kept very much secret. With these forms of circulation of information through media, through mobile phone, can we imagine a possibility of everybody producing some data at some point of time in the city, and therefore really producing a form of counter data, and counter data that would actually lead to some action and progressive action, a brighter, in that case, of course, a cleaner city? I'm not sure, I don't know. Does it mean that we are turning into a society of constant self-surveillance? We are all surveying all the others, or both. So this is some things I would like you to reflect upon. The third point, and maybe the last point I will bring about, is you mentioned the idea of, you again interlink the idea of technology and welfare. And I think it's very important, and I think it forces us to think about how do we bring back the notion of social compact and the notion of universalization and universal service. And when I was reading the text this morning, it's maybe the kind of things I read usually, so I was thinking, why isn't there the word targeting in his paper? But it is there towards the end of the paper, actually, and I was thinking because the technology, what this technology does, actually, all these new forms of information technologies, is really the ability to isolate groups. You mentioned it in the idea of that we can, if I check on the tariff of a plane ticket today, by tomorrow I will have hundreds of ads with different prices, etc. And in terms of the development world, it's really related to the idea of we can target groups. And we can target groups for their goods, for reducing poverty, for improving welfare schemes. So I think these are also very two related concepts. And the reverse notion of targeting is really the idea of universal services and the role of what political choices and social choices we make towards all the citizens of a city or a country. So I'm not going to go into this debate, but I was just thinking that the best, yesterday Jean Drèze wrote an article in the Indian Express where he expressed very clearly his anguish about the effect that linking Narega to the UID and to the Aadhaar was going to be, in fact, a very coercive tool, and a tool that was going to exclude many people and would have actually a negative impact on poverty. And I'm taking you out of the city, but I was also thinking by reading your paper about a talk I attended maybe 2-3 weeks ago, and which actually astonished me, it was a talk by Martin Revalion, about who is not maybe classified on the critical left, who was talking about the implementation of Narega in Bihar, and was explaining to the audience how targeting was very successful. The ability to actually target a number of households was very powerful, but the ability of this targeting to reduce poverty was actually almost nil. So his argument was actually that it would be much more efficient today to provide a minimum guaranteed income to everybody, men and women, and that would actually have a better impact on poverty than trying to devise very elaborated and complex schemes that actually do require a lot of this ICT and media technology support. Actually deciding that everybody would get a minimum income revenue would be rather simple, rather than using a lot of that algorithm and backed up GIS data to actually trying to target a population. So I think it raises a lot of questions about what do we bring back to the political agenda, and the idea of what is universal services, how do you apply it, and whether there is some groups that deserve or don't deserve services, and whether we should bring back to the political debate the idea that everybody should have access to basic services. And to conclude, and maybe just to come back to the title of that was given to you. I don't know if it was given or if you chose it, or it was given to me, which was about the city of the future. I think, of course, your presentation, you didn't talk much about it, but I think you will have to talk about it in the discussion, really opens up on this recent and crazy program on the smart cities, which is really centered around these technologies. And I think you've mentioned it, and I totally agree with you that, in fact, in the old cities, let's say the cities we live in, I think technologies are thought of solving the urban crisis, but in the smart cities, it even goes one step further. It's not even solving the crisis, it's just the insurance that it will be efficient and it will be productive. And this is very dangerous because, as you said, it resonates a lot with the post-independence planning thoughts. But I think it differs on two major points. First is the idea of inclusion, which I think has disappeared, and I would like to have your opinion on this, but for someone who has not worked, as you have, on the history of planning, I think it has disappeared from the language of city building. And the second is the role that private companies play in this dream of a fully Wi-Fi connected smart cities. And it is really raising a very strong question about the future of the cities. And just to follow on the words of caution you gave us today, really, and I think the critical thinker like you are very required because there is such a myth around technologies and media. I was wondering, I went to the Ramlila ground the day Arvind Kejriwal was swearing in his swearing ceremony. I was in this crowd of very young people, I have to say, boys and girls, mostly boys. Like today, in fact, but it seems to be a recurrent problem. And they were all registering on that smartphone what was happening, and I was wondering whether, at least at that time, now maybe it's not the case, I had a feeling that maybe it was a form of hijacking. And you've written on pirating, and I was wondering whether technologies are also maybe the future of hijacking or, hacking this kind of new regime that you seem to foresee.
Thank you, Mariel. That's excellent questions, and I have my plate is full. Now, let me just start with the first set of questions. The first question is really about: is it possible for us to think of an alternative future? Now, I personally I've never been anti-technology. I'm actually quite inflected, as all of us are. People may be in denial, but even the planned city was really a technological city. It had, informationalized grid. It had used cement. It used these are highly, technological solutions to the modernist design was really a technological intervention in urban design. So we can't run away. So informational elements are part of the scene. What is very interesting is someone like Mayer was part of cybernetic debates in the US. When he went back, he was part of the plan for Manhattan. And actually, I got so obsessed with the planning period, I went back and tracked some of his designs. And this is part of the plan for Manhattan in the case of a nuclear war. And they used cybernetic diagrams to map the city. So, this is going on for a long time. And we know about Corbusier's obsession with technology, planes and, the aerial vision. These are things we know. But I think what is very interesting today is I think there is a possibility, because we are a population of media producers, there is a possibility of creating commons-based solutions, and I've been very, very interested in this. The problem is, what kind of scale are you talking about? If we talk about the smart city scale, then we're finished. But I think if we pull the scale down, we have to move back from the great mistakes of large scale planning in the 20th century and large scale urban solutions. I think if we move back, there can be very, very interesting collaborative solutions based on commons activity. And I think one of the problems of policy is we don't find these sexy enough. And I think this is actually happening in cities all over the world. You can actually use very interesting mapping and technological solutions, producing neighborhood information systems, producing cultural mapping, overlapping cultural information, issues of inequality in the city. I think it's actually possible to produce all kinds of complex maps. So it's not one map, but a series of complex maps. And I think here the door is wide open, because remember, for the first time in the history of the third world, we have small computing devices. The phone is the first computing device in the third world. It's the first photographic device. Mass photography has come to the third world through the phone, not through the camera. I think 2% of the population had cameras before. This is the first photographic equipment, the first audio equipment. The way people, I know my carpenter has these sounds of his daughter, which he plays all the time. Beautiful, from the village. He's from Kurja. And this is a kind of completely new sense. This is what I mean by the sensorium has changed. It's a sense of what you call your sense of the city has changed. So I think these opens up all kinds of questions of what we can do. There's a kind of infrastructural reality which I think 20th century urbanism gave, and in which all kinds of interesting solutions and interesting experiments took place. It's not that the history of 20th century urbanism is a history of disaster. Absolutely not. There are all kinds of interesting initiatives that happened. So I think it's possible today, absolutely possible today, and we have to think out of the box and open up these questions. Now, as far as a title is concerned, this whole relationship between property title and enumeration, it's a very mixed bag. The answer is very mixed. We know that Bhumi didn't solve the scenario in Karnataka. Digitized property titling only introduced a second row of middlemen. It's exactly similar to this Aadhaar madness. So in my neighborhood, where there's a poor neighborhood where I live. So many of the people who work come from there. So to get a ration card and to get a gas connection, you also need Aadhaar now. So they have 8 forms of ID now they have to take to the gas thing. Before they had 6, now you have 8. And then to get into different information like RTE, if you're poor and you want to get into the school, how do you get into the school? They'll ask you for an income tax certificate. It's ridiculous. You're on the streets, you hardly have a home, you're spending thousands of rupees to get your children educated, right? And now you're hoping to get into a private school. You ask for an income tax certificate. How do you get an income tax certificate and a residence certificate? You go to the local agent. You pay 5,000 rupees. That's a standard rate. So what it means is new webs of intermediality come in. This is part of the paper system. It's not going to go away. So the digital system is mapped onto that. This is happening all over India. Fieldwork is the key. Fieldwork will tell you these things. And so people all over India are showing these. So in Bhumi, for instance, most of the farmers actually had a huge problem because there's this person who accesses the data in the database for them. It's like people who fill up visa forms for poor people wanting to go abroad, which are now all online. Can you imagine any farmer from Punjab trying to fill those 7-page visa forms from the UK or the US? I get a headache. So you have intermediaries. Intermediaries are crucial. So I think this infrastructure opens up a whole set of new intermediaries and new forms of mediation. Courts like it, I know campaigners like it, but as far as the field is concerned, this is what seems to be happening. The other thing is the question of targeting and services. I'm a great believer in some universal service provision, because I think one great model was the National Health Service in the UK, which was, you remember the UK was highly unequal society then, and it was in a real mess, and the Beveridge report, which asked for universal health care, which is what I think you need in India, pushed for universal access through user paying. It's a universal system. Everyone, it's a mode of equality. Just as the planners saw the map, the zoning map, as a way of creating an equal city, and Corbusier's famous grid as setting up an equal city. I think the health in equal access to certain forms of services and a basic access to certain forms of services is a model of, I think, which is still absolutely, out in the air. The more you privatize infrastructure, and health is a complete disaster. I mean, I think we are below Rwanda in access to health. Forget emerging country. I think it's so bad. So once you monetize it at that level, whatever amount of data babble you throw up, I think the key social questions are not going to go away. But I think there the interesting experimental initiatives are, including for pollution data. It can be pollution data, water data. It's already happening for schooling data. I think educational groups are already doing this in different parts. There's no reason we can't do this in cities. It should be easier in cities. And hopefully the Aam Aadmi Party, groups with Ashish Khaitan is running. You should definitely go there and make a pitch, and tell them that it's not just Wi-Fi in the city and CCTV cameras in buses, but I think there are very interesting options where their own experience of winning an election. They ran a very interesting informational campaign, mapping user flows onto constancy databases. It's a very interesting map they ran. This guy in IIT Bombay. So I think all kinds of interesting experiments are possible in cities all over India. So this is what I had to say now. I think I'll stop here. We can open it up.
Okay. Thanks, Ravi. Thanks, Mary Hélène. This is truly encyclopedic on the entire aspect of information and management of information that, of course, we are engaging with deeply. In order to try and make my position a little defensible, I do want to throw out the fact that possibly one of the words that needs to matter is also accuracy, and of course accuracy is itself something that can be problematized, but the fact that there is also a kind of tyranny of overwriting, I find that slide really fascinating. The way in which claims and identity tends to also almost get submerged under this kind of overwriting of records. So the record and the accuracy of the record is something that seems to be a really important issue for us to engage with. And I think I'm extremely thankful that you've illuminated the entire sort of universe of issues around this. But it seems that accuracy might possibly redeem the the manipulative economy in which a lot of the sort of disempowered seem to find themselves locked into that, and I think that argument really needs to be taken forward. So thank you for raising this incredible richness of the argument to both of you. We have very little time, but I think the audience might be wanting to raise a couple of issues.
Many of these things which you talk is actually about complete human settlement, not necessarily to urban rural both it is happening. And it has much more implications in terms of the future for the human settlement sector. I just thought somehow you missed, or you intentionally didn't mention RTI.
Yeah, it's there before.
Okay. Because that has been in the government sector, I realized. I think RTI has a lot of importance, and even the way we have started writing notes in the government system and keeping that, in spite of...
Including my institution.
I thought you were not public, right? No. You are RTI, okay. So it is, which I thought should, you did not mention, maybe. It's too. That's all, I have nothing else to add.
Sorry, can I be really quick and just make 2-3 points? One point I was trying to make was, I think in the sense that we see government operating on information technology is that they still see it as a replacement for the same paper system. So in that sense, it's still a sort of monolithic paper-based or kind of static thing, which gives rise to authenticity and control eventually. But on the other hand, private players and people are in fact trying to use it as a kind of dynamic and emergent force, which is eventually out of control. And it's actually good that it's kind of out of control. So they view it as very different things, both the players. And similarly, I mean, linked to that is the thing that governments in that sense are actually not, this money that the private players are monetizing. It's not that the government is giving money for it. It's that they're taking money which is also private at the end. So they're sort of acting like the middlemen there to kind of channel private money, which is much bigger, to other private, players. And so in that sense, what is the role of this thing called the government, which is it just sort of political, that they're shaping in some way the opinion on which how to monetize and how much to monetize. Uh, the, the third thing I was sort of trying to link it with is that we are trying to see that all of this process is becoming faster and faster. I mean, uh, we are what we envision, but the outcome of the vision usually happens after a little time lag. So what the outcomes of any sort of visionary movement are seen sort of after a while. But now, because these systems are much faster and the feedback loop is so small, uh, do we have any control over this so-called envisioned future? Or is it that the vision is created as, simultaneously as we are sort of thinking about the vision? So how do you think about time in that sense?
Actually, the first part I was not clear. This private taking from private. Actually, the government pays with taxpayer money, as far as I understand it. Pays taxpayer money, right? It pays taxpayer money, which is meant for a particular mediated through political, a political manifesto through which they fight elections. This is a kind of model of the state, the modern state, right? It's tax, it's tax, direct and indirect taxation, other forms of revenue collection, right? And there is a certain model. Now, what happens is that with the private players, even within the government, there's a model of private-public, because the government cannot map infrastructure fully and manage infrastructure. They can do it in collaboration with public-private. We've had public-private for many years. Public-private is also informationalized highly. Now, the fate of public-private, all of us in this room, we know. It's not been great. It's not been great. There now are regular articles saying why it's not been great. We need to do something else. And in the Chinese case, we know they created infrastructure with state intervention, right? And then they had, it's a well-known thing. And the most successful infrastructural expansion in recent history has been that model, with a strong state, right? Here we've had this model is basically through which the government sees itself incapable of generating knowledge, and so you give it to private players. Now there are different vectors, because a lot of the tensions in the government are intergovernmental, and sometimes it increases in intergovernmental tension. Informationalization. I remember speaking to financial ministry officials, and I asked him what I going to use Aadhaar everywhere. He says no, we are starting our own scheme. So, so this happens in every government department. People go, some of these smart kids from Bangalore go and pitch to them, and they say yes, this is very good. The secretary likes it, and then something. So this happens. It's very common in India, and this multiplication of informational vectors, which means how do they speak to each other? So Nilekani's model was the first infrastructural move nationally to try, in his opinion, to resolve it. There'll be one number which will speak to all the different databases. It will create value, so it will speak to private public, because his model, because private public players will get the data, they will manage the data, and every time you ask for enumeration, value will be created. It's a private model. It's a different. That's what I mean. It's a different model of the state. The state only ensures fair play, right? That's the model, and there is some notion of privacy. Though there's no privacy law, that's the. Now, insofar as private players are concerned, the last model that I talked about, which is now completely dominant. Your guess is as good as mine. You can, it's a very interesting scenario. I don't know if you followed any of the cases going on all these e-infrastructure providers. All the infrastructure companies, the big ones, are based in the US, at least the social media ones. So for case law, it's really tricky. If you can claim national security, social disturbance, and pull something down. But at the urban level, what do you do? At the urban level, because we are not talking of India in general, we are only talking of cities. Urban level, it would mean, transportation data, some urban marketing data that, if you have to map how goods are moving in the city, if you have to understand how markets work, you need online data. You absolutely need online data. You need to know how the intermediaries work. So is that data shareable? No. Are the phone companies, phone companies in Delhi at least are big infrastructural providers. They are managing spectrum. They are monetizing that spectrum through creating value chains. Is that available? No. Typically, if this were a public, system, we would say that certain forms of information should be available for public policy, isn't it? In the planner era, there's no problem because it came. Now, I think this is something all over the world urban authorities are waking up to. Because even there are private players that generate, because the state can't write these complex algorithms. You need to write these really complex algorithms. And most of the investment that is coming into these companies from abroad is to keep the prices very low, ridiculously low, so that they can get the market, and to hire people that can understand data. And urban data is a very specific thing. It's not data in general. You need to know how neighborhoods function, how buses move around, hospitals function, health information, pollution information. And I think it's an open question. It's actually a very scary question. It's a really scary question. And no one wants to think about this. At least in the 50s, we were better equipped with 100 years of debate on cities. Yes.
Hello. I don't think it's at all scary. I think it's the way of the future. That if you do accept that the notion of the state has irrevocably changed in the last 250 years, our relationship with technology has changed completely. Because what we've done in the last 250 years is that we've destroyed the planet's ecosystems. Technology has only increased the violence in our lives, whether it's software or hardware. Now, and with these two, I would just pick up one of the many things that I sort of noted down. But I just wanted to say that, neither of you, I'm sorry, you were both brilliant in your exposition and in your analytics, but neither of you actually, both of you, dodged the question of the future. I don't know why, but the excellent field work you have done really puts the future right in your hands, in your mind, straight away. Because that's what's happening, to my mind. I've lived outside the law for the last 15 years, extremely successfully. It's convivial, it's low carbon footprint, it is extremely convenient, it is civilized, as opposed to the city of the planner and of the government. The government is hardly existent. If 6 million people in Delhi can live outside the law successfully, what government and what state are we talking about? I think these are the questions, and I think it's a very sign of great hope. There is somebody who's been doing incredibly good work on urban legislation, Shirish Patel in Mumbai, and he's just sent me a very good paper which was published in EPW, I think, last month, on the affordable housing. And I was reading his paper. He's got a very good scheme. It makes a lot of sense. And he's going ahead and trying to get it done, a model development done in Mumbai, outside Mumbai. And I was thinking to myself, I read the paper, that, he's talking about an affordable future for citizens, but he's still doing the plan for it. Some centralized agent, some expert is still telling us how to live. Whereas I've lived for 15 years now without experts. And there are 200,000 people in my little settlement living with me just like that. We're doing very well, except we don't have drainage and sewage. But who has drainage and sewage in this country? So I would say that, come and see my field work. Thank you very much for an extremely interesting lecture. My only request to you, Jagan, is that you might try and find your timing such that there is more debate possible. Sure. We lack debate. We can give lectures, but we have no discourse. You have discourse in CSDS, but the CSDS is an island. It's not even an island. It's not even a speck. I've known CSDS in its early days.
Thank you, Muni. Obviously, we have at least two people I know love the Adda as a space, and perhaps we need to move closer into that.
Sir, I have just only one question. That you have said, it's been said that private players are coming onto the top. So I think the venture philanthropy should be an option. Do you think?
Okay.
Only one.
I mean, simple answer is yes, I suppose. Yes. Yes.
So, means it's also good that private players are also coming and they are also means engaging in this development activity.
There are two things we have to distinguish. One is companies that, private is a very vague term beyond a point. Beyond a point, I'm also private. I'm a private citizen. I treasure the little space I have. But we are talking of people whose mission as an institution, as a company, is the generation of value to create more value. Endless accumulation of wealth. That is a different, and information is the basis of creating wealth. That's a different model. But if you want civic options, I think civic interventions, small civic interventions are possible. That is private in a way, but it's not the same thing.
Yeah. I think Mary had raised a very interesting question about if there is an emerging new subaltern urbanism, whether that's possible through the media. And I think if you look at the Aam Aadmi Party's election victory, and if you look at the kind of causes around which they pitch their campaign, it's very clear that it has already emerged as a new subaltern urbanism. And the use of media in that election and this whole election itself has been a game changer for Delhi. In fact, it has altered all other models of elections we have had in the past. And it's likely to now repeat in other places because it's already shown that it's a possible model, that through a direct contact between the electioneering people and the poor, it is possible to actually give an upsurge to that constituency, which will then redefine the issues which are being thrown up for election, for the campaign. And we have seen how, water, electricity, all the municipal services and what the government is expected to provide and which the poor didn't get till now are actually the issues on which they have driven their whole election. And I think it's a very interesting key eye-opener and perhaps requires a little more closer look through some research to see how this use of electronics has actually altered the discourse in the election.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
So I'll try and conclude here. When I last engaged, or possibly the first time engaged with Ravi on discussions, we talked about public space. And I think I'd like to say that the Smart City mission is also trying to revive the discourse about the public. But we're really thankful for Ravi's extremely well-textured argument, which actually presents a mirror to this kind of a program. There is a rampant myth that the Smart City mission is all about ICT, and when it's launched, I am hopeful that there will be a revision of that idea, because it is actually driven towards a sort of new type of, not a new type, but actually new urbanism of some sort. Public spaces, a better quality of life, defined actually by the physical spaces created, not just about the technological enablement. But having said that, I think the mirror really helps, because it will make us more rigorous, I hope. And thank you, Mary Hélène, for pointing out the redemptive possibility of the solidarities, new solidarities that can be created through the identification also within the space and the use of these technologies. And possibly we will end up struggling between these two, the frightening future and the redemptive, possibly hopeful future. So thank you very much, and we are extremely, extremely thankful for both of you. Yeah, thank you.